Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, and we are specifically going to talk about an awesome new adventure hook that I'm presenting here today, specifically that is inspired from a absolutely fascinating IRL event, which explores what happens when we find the data does not connect to our perception of reality, and how we can use this to make a really good adventure that's raw and takes us to that extra place. I think as most dungeon masters, we're looking to run a story that's memorable, a story that makes the player characters think, something really special and next level, right? Like, I think that we're all there now, and I think this hits it. All right. So let me explain the impetus of this, right? So something really incredibly unique just happened that I thought was absolutely fascinating. And actually, an entire community of people thought this was really fascinating, too. It's one of the reasons why I bring it to you. All right. So I listened to what I think, in my opinion, is the best podcast that's ever been created. It's called the Slate Political Gabfest. It's been on for like 15 years. And I have a long relationship with the Slate Political Gabfest. I've listened to it, I think, for like 13 years. I think maybe I missed like the first year or two of the podcast, but I've listened to it the vast majority of its life. I listened to every single episode. You will hear me ask questions on some of the episodes because I have attended multiple Slate Political Gabfest live showings of the shows. I've seen them in Washington, D.C., Boston, Philadelphia. It's an incredible podcast. It's just really, really good. And by the way, I highly recommend everybody give it a listen. What it does is it takes all the politics of the week, crunches it down into 2 or 3 different segments, and the hosts talk about it. The hosts are Emily Bazelon, who is a writer and is connected to Yale. And she also has, I think she was a lawyer. And she's a SME, a subject matter expert on the law. David Plotz, he's been a CEO of multiple companies, and he used to be a journalist and writer. All of these people are writers. And then last is John Dickerson. John Dickerson, you can see him like literally on CBS, like Face the Nation. He's nationally syndicated. He's been on. I think he was on like 2020. He was on Face the Nation. Like these people got real chops, right? Like these are real American celebrities. Not A-list Hollywood celebrities, but as far as politics go and the Washington set, these people are known and they're important, and they're very, very good at what they do. Okay, now Emily Bazelon, David Plotz, John Dickerson, they get together every week for an hour to an hour and a half to produce this podcast, and it's really good, and it covers national politics. Okay, national U.S. politics. It has a super woke, pretty liberal fan base, right? I think it's hard to say where I am. I'm conservative enough to frustrate some people and liberal enough to frustrate others. Like it's hard to say, right? Like, but I don't want to get distracted. Let's keep moving here. They mostly have a very liberal fan base, right? And one of the things that happens is they interact with their fans, which is great. Like, that's one of the best things about having a show or anything. You talk about anything like, my channel here is very much like a podcast, very similar, right? And the best thing about it, by far, by the way, in case anybody's out there thinking like I'm raking it in from this, I've literally never made a single dollar from my channel, right? I do this for the interaction between me and people who like to hear what I have to say. It's the only pay, and it's the best part of the pay, and it's worth every minute spent. I genuinely appreciate all the interaction I get from everybody. All right, so from people who are wishing upon my upfall. let's put it that way. All right, not wishing upon my downfall, which there's a few. Wow. All right, so this thing is incredible. And so what happened, right? Well, this female viewer, right, got real. People get really furious with David Plotz. He is the main impetus of the show. He's the driver of. Actually, he's the main. He is responsible to drive the conversation, right, and to make it lively, to make it pop. and to make it good. And it is good. It's lively. It pops. It's really good. It's a big part of my life. I listen to it every week, and it's always a spot of joy. And I don't take those for granted anymore, right? Like, since March 2020, all of our worlds have gotten a little darker. So I don't take a single element of joy for granted, right? So basically, what happened was, one of the followers of the show would get furious when David Plotz would interrupt Emily, okay? And because it's a liberal viewership, she said, like, I got into a feminist rage at how many times David Plotz would, that's literally what they said. She said on the, they covered this on the show and went over her data. This fan who tracked data on their show. So this feminist got very angry and said and decided she was going to track every time that David Plotz interrupted Emily, okay? So, what happened? Well, she tracked the data. She actually sat down, listened to every single episode for 55 episodes, right? So that's over a year's data, okay? And she used a programming language called R to track all the instances. And what she found was that Emily Bazelon interrupted 13 times an episode, David Plotz interrupted 9 times an episode, and John Dickerson interrupted 6 times an episode. When she plotted it out, right, she found that Emily was being interrupted half as much. Emily, the female member of the podcast, was interrupted half as much as both. She was interrupted half as much as David was interrupted half as much as John Dickerson was interrupted, and she interrupted both of the other hosts more than she was interrupted, right? So this feminist found that the data proved her worldview 100% wrong. And she realized, and so when you look at the data, you realize sometimes when we look at a situation, we go in with a perception, but the reality is different than our perception. And we now know that this feminist was hearing every time David Plotz or John, well, specifically, we know that this feminist was hearing every time David Plotz interrupted Emily Bazelon, but this feminist also was selectively not hearing when Emily was interrupting both. Was interrupting John more than he interrupted her, and David Plotz more than he interrupted her, right? So her worldview was 100% wrong, and the reality was different than she perceived, right? I'm absolutely fascinated by this. Like, and actually, the entire Slate community was like, their jaws just dropped to the ground when the data was dropped, right? It's incredible. How do we use this in our Dungeons & Dragons games? Well, first of all, I'm going to give you a nice adventure hook that sprang to mind as soon as I heard this story, right? And you're going to have this adventure that you'll be able to run anytime you want, okay? But in addition to that, in addition to having this adventure, remember the principle of it, because you can take whatever adventure you're running right now and drop the principle in. All right. So here's the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition adventure. All right. So the players roll into a small village. They are received and they're welcomed, right? And they just make it so that they come in after an adventure and they're still maybe wounded, right? Although I guess that's hard in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But make them low on provisions. Make them need something from the village if you can, okay? And so they roll into this village, and the village is like, hey, thanks for visiting our village. We appreciate it. And, or actually, hey, welcome to the village, right? And then they're going to be offered hot soup, and there's no, like, inn, right? It's just, like, shack huts. And this village is a bunch of woodcutters, right? And they actually cut wood in the forest around them, and then they transport that to castles and cities that are around them, and that's how they make their living all year long. And it's a relatively poor. There's only 70 people who live in the village, and it's relatively poor. There's just a few families, right? And basically your player characters will learn the following. They'll learn that the village leader is much beloved by the people, but even more beloved than the village leader is his brother. Okay, and both of them have families in the village, right? And what they find is that about a year and a half ago, actually 3 years ago, in the mountains, 2 miles west of the village, a goblin warren began, and there are goblins that live up there. Okay, that happened 3 years ago. A year and a half ago, one of their pigs was found missing, and everybody was like, "It's the goblins," right? So they know the goblins are up there, and they suspect the goblins took one of their pigs. But 4 months ago, okay, 3 pigs were slaughtered, right? Just shredded, right? And also some sheep were also slaughtered as well, right? And so that happened 4 months ago, and then 3 months ago there were additional slaughterings of pigs and sheep, and one of the villagers, another villager, one of the woodcutters, disappeared. Okay. Then on the 1 month, and then 2 months ago, it was calm and quiet for that month, and then 1 month ago it happened again, right? And there were slaughterings of pigs and sheep. So right now you have close to half a dozen pigs that have been slaughtered, half a dozen sheep that have been slaughtered over 4 months, and there's a missing person. Okay, so the villagers are angry. Okay, and they say to the heroes, "Listen, we need you to go clear out that goblin warren," right? Now, and the village leader will say, "Listen, I need you to go clear out the goblin warren. Just take care of this problem, because we can't keep having this." And then the player characters also hear a disgruntled person in the village saying, "Yeah, go get him," right? I'm sorry. The other person says, "Yeah, well, we don't need these. We don't need to give the few gold coins we have to these adventurers. We, as the village, should go up there and slaughter all those goblins," right? So now they only offer them 20 gold, because that's literally all they have, right? And that's not really enough for your adventuring group to go clear out a goblin warren, right? But they get the sense that this is very real, right? Like, this is a real problem for these people. Okay. Now, so they may take the job just to help the villagers, right? The other thing, and basically at this point, the crew, right? They may just leave on to the next town, which is fine. You can allow that, right? Like, sometimes you put adventures in front of your players. Sometimes they take it, sometimes they don't, right? But if they decide to take the job, they go up into the hills. Okay. When they go up into the hills, they come across a hedge witch, right? And she is up there, and she has a hut in the woods, and she is collecting herbs, and she's actually visited by multiple adventurers who buy herbs from her for spell components and potions and all kinds of things, and she does very well but she lives apart from the village, right? So the adventurers go up, and they're ready to slay the goblins, right? Okay. Now you can throw in an encounter here. They could be actually just go right into Xanathar's. There's lots of mountain and forest encounters. I might throw 6 wolves at them just to scrape them up a little bit, But so what do you do? So when they reach the hedge witch, right? The hedge witch says, "Hey, you're on my land. Can you guys go around? I'm growing some mushrooms in this area," right? If they interact with her, right, for even a little bit, she'll say, "Where are you going?" And they'll say, "We're going to kill the goblin warren." If they tell her they're going to knock out the goblin warren, right, she will say, "Oh, well, you probably shouldn't do that," right? And they'll say, "Why?" And she'll say, "Well, here's the deal, right? 3 years ago, there was a fire in the forest down there, and the brother of the headmaster, he really pulled the entire town through, or the villagers through, and this entire village might have dispersed and not even be here anymore, right? But he really helped them in crisis, okay? But recently, that brother was turned into a werewolf. And it is not those goblins up there who are the enemy of that town. It's the brother that's within it. But he is a folk hero, right? And I suspect his own brother knows what's happened, but is unwilling to have his brother pushed out of the village or killed, right? Now, the player characters are exactly where, now your players are where that feminist was. They have information they don't want to give the village, right? Because if they go down there, there's going to be, if they go kill the goblin warden, they can keep the 20 gold, right? And the villagers are going to be like, thank you very much, and will receive them with open arms. If they go back and say, the goblins are not your enemy, right? They may have stolen a pig a year and a half ago, but the reality is the horrors that you're seeing right now are from your own folk hero, the village headman, the village elder, the village leader's brother. He is your real problem. This is going to be terrible, right? He's got a family, right? And and the reality is also, by the way, he just, the brother actually went out and buried the body in the woods, and that's where, and the hedge witch can actually show them where the body of the missing woodcutter is, right? So he really is a werewolf, and that's what's happening. It's not the goblins, right? But this is very uncomfortable information. This is data that that the player characters have discovered that they don't want to tell people, and people don't want to receive that data, right? And I really think this will fire on all cylinders. You don't want to do this too many times, but this is really unique and special and real and good. This is a good, solid impetus for a story for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, right? Because I think one of the things is, like, a lot of times we have a perception that we think something is right, but we're completely wrong. And the reality is a different way than we thought, right? And the other thing, just to be clear too, one thing that was fascinating about this feminist's opinion was it was very widely held within the community. No one had said what she had said before. In fact, it was uncontested that David Plotz was an interrupter, and no one had ever accused Emily of being an interrupter at the community level, and the community was shocked and appalled to hear this information, right? They were like, it was upsetting, right? Like, and so I think this is a really good impetus for a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. I was fascinated by this IRL event. I think it's a lesson for us as dungeon masters and as people. Like, when we think we're right and we hear somebody, and we're going along with the crowd, but there's a lone voice saying something else, that's right. One, you gotta wait for the data, right? And that doesn't always help today, but I still think, data is, especially, data is an interesting point, but I really think we should respond to data if we can, right? I think that's getting more and more difficult nowadays because people question sources. But, the nice thing about this data from the podcast is, one, it's 100% reproducible. The person's numbers can be reproduced by anybody else by doing the same check, right? And then the other thing is, once it was heard, most people are like, yeah, that makes sense, right? And so let's just watch for our own prejudice. And actually, I think this is a great hook for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game. I'm presenting it here for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about what are some perceptions that we may have, right, that we feel strongly about, but that the data just doesn't represent it? I'd love to hear if you've come across that, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on running this specific Dungeons & Dragons hook. Thank you very much. Please consider subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.